Welcome everyone to episode 95 of Raw Sport. We are back with another banger of an episode. Today we host a very special guest, the man himself, Mr. Kevin Iole. Kevin, welcome to the show, buddy. How's things?
I appreciate you, Ahmad. Thanks for having me on. I'm doing great. Looking forward to all these fights we have coming up.
Lots of action coming up in both codes. You're one of the rare individuals in the world of martial arts or the fight world that covers both sides, MMA and boxing, which brings me to my first question today. The state of boxing. You've covered boxing for decades, and you've seen the ups and downs and so on and
Oh
so
yeah.
on, the evolutions, the changes. As a sport, are we better off today than where we were 10 to 20 years ago, or are we worse?
I think there's a lot of good young fighters coming into the sport right now. Like from a business standpoint, I think there's no question it's worse, right? There's less promoters out there, and there's less promoters who have a stable of fighters, right? Like I think, you mentioned 20 years ago, and you're talking, there was probably 8 or 10 promoters around the world that had big stables of fighters that were elite and everything. And now you have just a handful of those, and it is different. I don't know that I would say that the fighting is any better or any worse now than it was then. I do think we're getting a lot of good young talent coming into the sport right now, and if we take advantage of it, I think we can be in a really, what I would say is like a golden era, right, where we can have some fighters that become stars and that are good. But the problem is, that they don't get promoted, and especially a lot like kind of what I think has happened is sort of the reverse of maybe for much of my career. A lot of the times there were fighters in other parts of the world outside of the U.S., especially in the U.K., that got overlooked, that were good fighters that maybe in this country did not get a fair shake. And now I think it's the opposite. A lot of times, right? You go, a lot of the fights that are in Saudi Arabia or in England, they don't even get promoted in the United States. And so people here, like, you really have to want to find the fights to know when they're on, who's fighting, and that type of thing. And as a result, I think that hurts. So I think it's a mixed bag, Ahmad, of where we are right now.
Well, are we seeing boxing losing its soul a bit in the pursuit of modernization and big money deals?
Well, I think that you have to pursue big money. Look, these guys are going out there and they're trying to, get punched and hit in the head. You're taking a risk. I have been ringside for 7 fighters who passed away in the fight, let alone scores of fights that I've had to write where unfortunately a fighter passed away where I wasn't at ringside. So, you want to make sure the fighters are paid as much as they can when you're in a fight. But what money can't take over the sport, right? You have to remember that it is a sport, and it has to be done so that we can make good fights up and down the cards. Like if I were to look at one thing about boxing today is that we don't have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 fights on a card where we say, boy, I'm really looking forward to this one, or I'm looking forward to this one. It's usually you're really looking forward to the main event. Sometimes there's another fight on the undercard that you like. And then, the rest of them are like, 25 to 1 favorites. And, that to me hurts the sport because people who casually tune in and there might be a fight that they tune in. And if all they see is blowouts, then they're unlikely to come back.
Absolutely. And that even competition is something that the sport really starves. Sorry. And I think now that we've seen these new power brokers come through, the Saudis, we're starting to see a bit more of that, which moves me on to my next question. How do you feel about the rise of Saudi Arabia as boxing's new epicenter? Are we seeing
Uh,
progress, or was it just a power grab?
Repeat that again for me one more time.
How do you feel about the rise of Saudi Arabia's presence in the sport and becoming the epicenter for
Yeah.
boxing?
I think it was a lack of management on boxing's part, right? There was, boxing is a global sport, and unlike almost any other sport you can think of, whatever sport it is, soccer, we have FIFA, the NFL, we have Roger Goodell running it, Major League Baseball, NBA. There is a governing body over everything else, and in boxing there is not. And it's almost like every man for himself, and it's a worldwide sport where the rules are different, not only from country to country, but then like within the United States, you go to this state and this is the rules, and you go to this state and this is the rules. And so the sport is kind of like the wild west of sports, and it put itself in that position, right? So it put itself in a position where somebody like the Saudis could come in and take it over. Now, I think there's good and bad in everything, and I think there's good and bad in the Saudi takeover. And I won't even get into the political aspect of it, right? Let's just talk about it from a sports standpoint. I think it's great that if you think, I think they've been in since like 2019, but really I would say 2023 is when Turkey al-Sheikh and a lot of the fights have been financed by the Saudis. And I think if you look at the fights that have been made that would never have been made, and Eddie Hearn and Frank Warren working together, and all the different things that have happened subsequent to Turkey coming into boxing and the Saudi money, that's good. But there's a lot of bad stuff. Like I have said this many times. I'm on the West Coast in the United States, so I'm in the Pacific time zone. So a lot of the fights that are in Saudi Arabia will start at 8 o'clock in the morning here, right? And it used to be that main events would go Saturday afternoon, but that's 40 years ago in the United States, and people aren't used to that time frame. It's not being promoted, it's not being put out there so the public knows. So people have things to do, and they're not watching the fights, and so the pay-per-views do terrible. The streaming services don't do well in the U.S., and it's largely getting ignored. So I think that there's it's kind of like a balance. I'm now that Turkey is doing what he's doing, both with Ring Magazine, so he's making more of a commitment to worldwide, and then also his partnership with TKO. I'll have an open door and I'll see how they do, and my mind won't be closed on what they're trying to accomplish.
So earlier this morning, or earlier today, numbers came out that the last crescendo did 340,000 pay-per-view buys worldwide. We look at Gervonta Davis versus Lamont Roach. The reported numbers were 260,000 pay-per-views in the US alone. So are we seeing how do we see a business model like this survive and prosper? Or is it even possible when we're seeing locally in America it's doing a lot better than what if you look at apples to apples and oranges to oranges?
Well, the problem, hey, look, the last crescendo was a far better card on paper and then in practice, right? It was a better card. The fights were better than the Gervonta Davis card. Plus, the last crescendo in the United States was $25, and the Gervonta Davis fight, if I remember correctly, was $85. It was ridiculous, right? So it should not have been the way it was, but the one fight was in prime time in the United States. The other fight, like I mentioned just a minute ago, I covered both of those shows. That started at 8:30 in the morning in the U.S., right? So people, or at least in Las Vegas, right? It started on the West Coast. And you're talking on the West Coast, a lot of really big cities that are big boxing cities, right? That are basically shut out when you're starting that early. Then, they don't promote. They did not promote in the United States. They're not making it. If you didn't go to the show, they're not making anybody available to people in the U.S. They're not, it was just a total nothing in terms of promotion. So how do you expect people in the United States who are not boxing fans? Because the one thing we know is the success of a pay-per-view is driven by the casual or even the occasional fan. The hardcore fans buy almost all the shows. So, but they're also the smallest audience, right? The hardcore fan base is the absolute smallest audience. So when you had a Floyd Mayweather fight that did big, it was because you had people that, didn't really follow boxing, but said, hey, let's see if that loudmouth Mayweather gets knocked out. And they would tune in to see him lose, right? Same same thing that happened with Mike Tyson. They maybe wanted to see Mike win, but they wanted to see Mike knock somebody's head off. You don't have that now with, the way the fights are promoted, because nobody knows when they're on, the way it's going. So I think that's something from a business standpoint that really is desperate to change.
You said something very important there. You said if you weren't at the show, you didn't have access to the fight. Are you talking about boxing media?
Yeah, of course.
And do you know why that was the case?
They don't care about the U.S. market. So, like, I could email Queensberry Promotions, hey, I want to do an. I've known Frank Warren for 40 years. I can't get an interview with Frank Warren about the biggest show of the year. I just can't, just can't get him. He's got other stuff going on. They just don't care about the United States market. It used to be that they would kiss our butt and we could get anybody, right? But we can't do that anymore. And that is true of, I was talking to one of my colleagues, Dan Rayfield, saying, he had the same issue. And there's a lot of people that are in that boat. So, I wrote, like, take that last Crescendo. I wrote and did videos every single day the week of the fight. Plus, I had written, going up, leading up to the fight, right? But they just never acknowledged that, hey, here's somebody that's trying. Let's let at least somebody who wants to cover the fight, help them. They just didn't care. And I think that's one of the problems that goes on in boxing today. And so I think, is if we're going to fix this, not that, the promoters need to be buddy with the media. That's not their job and that's not our job, but they have to make information available and they have to give you access. And that's really, I don't know how it is in the UK, but in other parts of the world, Mexico and other places where boxing is big. But I know in the United States that, they just blow us off.
The biggest market in the world. How do you ignore the biggest market in the world unless it's political?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's political, but I think it's a thing that, so I think the rise of, and not that it's not always been popular, but say the rise of popularity in boxing in the United Kingdom, so the Joshua Dubois fight does 96,000. They just think we don't need the U.S. anymore, right? But they don't realize that this is the world's largest economy, and this is where that economic engine of the sport is. And if boxing is good in the United States, it's going to be good worldwide. But if boxing is not good in the United States, it's going to have an impact worldwide. And so I think that they need to be a little bit smarter about that. And I think that is something that I'm hoping Turkey starts to recognize and will work to change.
Well, it's a perfect segue into my next question. He's going to have to, if he's going to make this Dana White new TKO boxing league work. What are your thoughts on the new league and its structure from the limited information that we've been fed so far?
Yeah. I am optimistic, but I'm not going to sit here and say it's a slam dunk, right? One of the problems that I think they are going to have is fighters under contract, right? So right now, what Turkey's been doing is, Turkey's been reaching out to fighters on his own and saying, hey, I want you to fight this guy, and bypassing the managers, bypassing the promoters, and then they get, and the fighter will then turn around to their team and say, make this fight because I want the fight. But now that he is going to be in charge of a league, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to do that. So just imagine, a lot of the Turkey shows have been populated by three promoters. They're fighters from three promoters: Matchroom, Queensberry, and Golden Boy Promotions. Now all of a sudden, they're not going to want to cooperate with TKO. TKO is going to do their own thing, right? And they're going to try to eventually sign fighters. And I think that's where the issue becomes, right? I think that is a big problem. And so Dana White is a smart guy, and I think the UFC model will work if given a chance. But my reticence is in saying that it's going to be a slam dunk is they have to have good fighters to begin with to get attention, right? Because if you're putting on guys ranked 30, 35th in the world, that's not going to get the attention of the public. I know that their first show is most likely going to be that Crawford-Canelo fight. I don't know if you saw the clip on the Pat McAfee show here in the U.S. where Turkey was starting to say that was going to be the fight, and Dana and telling him to be quiet.
Pump the brakes, he said.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, that'll be their first show. So that'll be good. But I wonder even about that because UFC last Saturday announced UFC 320 for Guadalajara, Mexico that night. So, and it's going to be UFC Noche too, which was a big event for them last year. So who knows, when they're going to kick it off. But I think they need to get some big name fighters under contract. That is imperative.
Wow. Do you think the payment structure or that negative stigma that's come from the UFC will put fighters off in this new TKO boxing league?
In terms of their purses?
Yeah, underpayment apparently. We're just going off what's been reported.
I don't know that is true. What has been reported, so we shall see. And and yes, I think if you're going to turn around and you're going to tell somebody that's made $15 million, I think they said for championship fights it's going to be $750,000. You're going from $15 million to $750. I think they're going to raise a hand with a finger lifted up and say no, thank you, and go somewhere else. So which is. There's a lot of reasons that I don't believe it, but that's another reason right there. Now, I have said for a long time that I think the pay structure in boxing needs to be redone. And the UFC gets ripped because they say they're not paying the fighters enough. But the fighters at the bottom and the middle in the UFC make a lot more money than the fighters at the bottom and the middle in boxing. It's at the very top where you have 1% of the fighters in boxing making 99% of the money. And then it's hard to make even matches, and you can't go, that thing then gets down. So I have said long before Dana White ever talked about getting into boxing that boxing really needed to redo the pay structure. And the only people in my mind that were deserving of that kind of money, there was a handful. Obviously Anthony Joshua, he drew 96,000 people to Wembley Stadium. Of course he deserves that kind of money. He's putting butts in seats. He's selling pay-per-views. Although Anthony Joshua sold 0 pay-per-views over here. Nobody cared about him, right? Joshua, nobody cared. But Mayweather, like you think Mayweather, he all around the world, he was popular. He generated so much money. So if you do that, that's one thing. Right, but for a guy to say, well, I'm 30-0 and I got 25 knockouts, that's why I should get, $15 million. That's not how it works, and that's not how it works in any business. And being successful is part of it, but you have to also generate the revenue for it. And so, I think that, I don't believe those numbers that were put out. If those numbers are true, then I think it's a big issue. But I just don't believe that they're necessarily true.
On the business side and media side in boxing, are promoters and networks pricing fans out of the sport with these crazy $79, $80 pay-per-view prices?
I'm sorry, how do they do it? How they deal with it?
No. Do you believe that these networks and promoters are pricing fans out of the sport by having such high pay-per-view prices? And if so, how do we fix this?
So, I am hoping, the UFC's contract is coming up, and I am hoping the pay-per-views go away in their next contract because I think that, you might see Netflix or YouTube or Amazon or Apple buy it out and just say, we're going to put the fights on our service and they're going to pay a higher rights fee and buy it out. And if they do that, I think that is going to be good. But I think it's no question an issue, Ahmad, that, the average person cannot afford to pay these kind of prices. Now, think about what it costs you if you want to be a boxing fan. So if you're, and I only know the United States prices, but I'll say it's $225 in the US to subscribe to DAZN. Plus, how many pay-per-views does DAZN do a year? So if you want to watch most of them, Then it costs you $110 to have ESPN Plus, so you can watch the boxing matches that they have on, and they have a few, that go up. Then, you have to have streaming services. If you wanted to watch Mike Tyson and Jake Paul, you had to have Netflix. And so you're asking the fans, even before you go to the pay-per-views, to put up, several $100s a year before they've ever done anything. And then you're asking them, like you mentioned, $80, $90 pay-per-view prices. It's just not sustainable. And I think, that in the U.S. where NFL and NBA are so huge, right? Their championships are on free over-the-air television, where they're available to over 100 million people, right, on television, let alone streaming. And so that is creating an issue for the fight game, and I think that is something that they need to solve, and solve in a big way.
Absolutely. You've seen the evolution of fight media over the years, from the radio to TV, newspapers, and so on. How much has social media played a role in this new boxing world that we see, and has it been for the better or the worse?
I would say mostly for the worse, but some for the better, right? So there's an immediacy out there, which leads to inaccuracies. But you will find out, hey, if a fight gets made today, I don't have to wait. I can find out 5 minutes after it's made, or a lot of times before the fight is made. When they're just talking about the fight, we can find out that a fight is made, because you go on X or you go on somewhere else, and either the fighter, the manager, the promoter, or a media person puts that out there. That information is available. But where it is worse is there's not that, you have to have some kind of ability to introduce the fighters to the people. Why do I want to watch these two guys fight? Not every fight is going to be the greatest fight of all time. And if you say that too often, you're just going to, make everybody run away, because you're like the boy who cried wolf. But if you can go out there and you can say, hey, this person, this is his backstory, this is her backstory, and have those kind of compelling takes that, we used to see, and you think of all the great, fight writers that there have been all around the world for so long, that they told these amazing stories, then I think, that's what we missed. When I first started, and my first title fight was I think either 80 or 81, Larry Holmes versus Ronaldo Snipes. I covered my first actual pro fight in 1979. I was still in college. But, there were two newspapers in every major city in the United States. In some cases, like New York and LA, there was three or four. And you go around the world, and that was the case. And so you would go to a fight, and there would be all this slew of mainstream media, all of whom were looking for stories to tell, the backstories of the fighters. And now we get YouTubers going on there, and they're holding up cameras, and they're saying, what do you think of your opponent? Who do you want to fight next? And what do and it's the same three or four questions, and there's no depth of coverage, right? And so I think that becomes, a detriment to the sport. So I think, social media is good in a lot of ways, and people who are smart in how they, Ryan Garcia is a genius at it, right? And the people who are good at how they use it, I think it helps, and it makes them bigger. But not enough people know how to use it properly, and they think just by putting out one or two things, hey, so and so's fighting so and so tomorrow, that that's going to be effective, and that's not the way it's going to work.
So, Kevin, now that you look at it all and you've seen the many evolutions, is boxing journalism evolving for the better, or is it getting diluted in this influencer narrative or fan first narrative world?
I think it's not as good as it should be, right? And I think it's because it's not as there's not as many jobs, right? So right now it's a passion play. If you want to do boxing journalism, you have to love the sport, right? It's not like a lot of times you might get assigned to it, and then you turn out, hey, there's so many great stories here that I want to stay with this because I love all these characters that there are in boxing. But now it's like you have to be a boxing fan and want to do it, and probably lose money to do it, just to be able to get out and do that. And it is, it's tough, right? So I think that, the way the media market is now, because of, like look in the United States and forgetting just the other sports, all the other entertainment options we have here, right? So on a Saturday night, people might say, well, there's a basketball game on and there's, but there's movies on every street corner. There's, I live in Las Vegas, the city of entertainment, right? I have a million different things that I can do on Saturday night here in Vegas. And, not all of them are fights, right? And so, I think that becomes a big issue. And, there's a lot of competition for the sport. I think if you can build the sport back up, right? They did it with the UFC. And Dana White and Lorenzo Fertitta did it. So when I say they in boxing, I'm not talking about Dana and Turkey. I'm just talking about boxing in general. It can be rebuilt again because at its best, boxing is a phenomenal sport, and boxing is a sport that people love and get into and look at it. But there's so many issues. People think I don't believe the judging is corrupt for the most part, right? I think there's some people that are better than others as judges, but people don't, they don't trust the judges. They don't trust the referees. They don't trust the promoters. They don't trust the sanctioning bodies. And, you just add all these things together and it just erodes the confidence in the entire sport.
So, Kevin, you've lived in both worlds. What's the UFC doing right that we aren't doing in boxing?
Well, I think, they had a fortunate break because when Dana White, bought it, what did he buy? He bought a broken down octagon in 3 letters and a handful of fighter contracts. They weren't allowed on TV in the United States. It wasn't legal in most states in the United States, and it certainly wasn't legal outside of the United States, right? Other than Brazil, Japan, and, maybe 1 or 2 other places. So he was able to take and say, okay, what do I like about boxing? Because for people who don't know, Dana White is a huge and a longtime boxing fan. And I mean, he is a hardcore boxing fan. Now, he rips it all the time because he hates what has happened, but he is a huge boxing fan. And so he and Lorenzo sat there and said, let's take the things that we like about boxing and keep it in MMA, and the things that we don't like, let's take out. So you don't have the issue with sanctioning bodies, the WBA and the WBO coming up with these goofy mandatories, and the champion has to give up his belt to fight the fight that people really want to see. You don't have that in the UFC. They make even matches up and down the card. Even at the bottom of the cards where maybe some of the fighters aren't as good, they're evenly matched. And the public can't tell that they're not as good, right? Like if they're evenly matched in their competitive fights, people like them. And that's what they like. They like seeing evenly matched fights, and then they like seeing finishes. And the UFC rewards finishes. They go out there. So the way they built their sport was, hey, let's take what's good about boxing and keep it, and what's bad about boxing, get rid of it and try to, bring it up. I think if boxing did some of those things, if everybody would work together, it would have a chance. The problem that you have in boxing is that so many people are fractured, and this guy hates this guy, and he won't promote with this guy, and blah 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 blah. That now all of a sudden nobody wants to work together, and so it's just this this collection of loosely affiliated promoters that it's a crazy system.
On the media side, did they do anything that really stood out to you that hasn't been done in boxing or is not being done in boxing?
Well, they just do so much, right? Like, I mean, and just specifically to the UFC, they are such better promoters than anybody in boxing. And the volume of stuff that they put out, the creativity that they put out, some boxing PR people think that they are quote unquote promoting the fight if they call up and say, hey, Kevin, I got, Joe Blow fighting on Saturday night. Do you want to do a 10-minute interview with him? And they think that that's promoting a fight. And that's like one thing out of 100 that, a PR and marketing team need to be doing to get the word out on a show. And they don't do any, most, I don't want to say any, but most of the rest of the things they don't do. And so I think, when you look at what the UFC does and how they, how it operates, right? I just think it's worlds above anybody else. So what can boxing learn from what they do? Well, you're going to have to spend and invest money back into the sport. Like when you look at Dana taking the fights around the world in the early 2000s, they were getting financially killed. At one point, they were $40 million in the hole. But what was the advantage? They everywhere they went that was new, all of a sudden MMA took a big leap up. When they went to Australia for the first time, boom, gyms started opening, fighters started training. When they went to Ireland, Conor McGregor went to one of their first shows. He said, I want to do this. And he got into it. He helped make the sport explode. In England, it happened, and it produced Michael Bisping. And you think of all those, so he basically said, we're going to invest in promoting this sport around the world. We're going to go the best we can, and we're going to bring it everywhere, because if you see one of our live shows, you're going to be hooked. And I think that that's something that boxing could do, but they don't want to do, because they don't want to in the and I understand, hey, it's tough. The margins are small. There's not, a lot of cases you lose money on every show, and you make one show a year that makes your money, and that's it. It's a tough business.
Boxing's had a lot of money come into it, but it's coming with big egos that want to dominate the sport, take over the sport. And my fear is that the group at TKO, backed by His Excellency, comes in with that same attitude. But I believe I've got some faith in Dana.
Well, here's what I would have to say, right? I mean, number one, think back to even when HBO was still doing boxing. They got out of boxing in 2018. It was very common in the United States for HBO to say pay a $4 million license fee, and that entire license fee would go to one person on the show. So the promoter now has got such, he's got to pay the rest of the fighters on the card. He's got to promote the show. He's got to get all the things that he has to do that cost money. And he doesn't have, his license fee went to the star fighter. There's not a lot of revenue streams that were in there. So now with Turkey, right, I think he's got unlimited funds. So if he can help, or virtually unlimited funds, like if there's no such thing as unlimited, but virtually unlimited funds, if Turkey, and this, I think that's a positive sign that he wants to work for Dana. You've used that word, Ahmad, dominate the sport. The fact that he wants to go to Dana White, who's going to do it very differently than he's done it, says to me he understands that UFC has done it one way and that's successful, and let's try to see if we can make it work in boxing. So we'll see. Turkey, some of the things that he's been doing, like I think they're going to get their asses killed on the show in New York Times Square, right? But it's going to be a really cool show. The visual on TV is going to be good. I like the idea of three, compelling fights that all have significance to them about what's going to come next. They're talking about doing a show in Alcatraz, which will be really wild. A prison that has been closed for 60 years. It's out in the Bay in San Francisco. That'll be really something if they do. So there are some positive signs that Turkey is doing the right thing. So I'm not sure that I would agree. I understand where you're coming from with the question, but I'm not sure I totally agree with the premise.
Absolutely, that's fine. We can agree to disagree. That's the whole point of conversation. Absolutely. If we look at the current landscape of boxing, and this morning again, your morning and my today evening, Dana White announced a huge deal with Meta.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you've seen that. Now, for those that are not too aware of how the current UFC fighter rankings are done, it's pretty much based on the riders, right?
Yeah. So I have never participated, and if you look at the group of fighters the writers that vote, a lot of them I've never met. Like a lot of them are never at the show. So when they put it out, Dana personally called me when they first started doing the rankings, which was 10, 12 years ago. And he said he wanted me to participate in the rankings. And I looked at it and I thought about it and I thought, well, this is going to affect how much the fighters make, and it's going to affect their careers in a lot of ways. And I thought it was unethical for me to get involved and do that, because I may in good faith think you deserve to be ranked 10, and you may think you deserve to be ranked first, and I vote you 10th, and I cost you a title fight, let's say, right? Quote unquote, cost you a title fight, because you fall in the rankings. as a result, that's just putting media. I felt that was putting media people in a bad situation, and that's not. That's why I have been against the ring titles since they came out with the ring titles. I don't think journalists have business giving out championships in any sport, right? The journalists are there to cover the sport and report on what happens, not be involved. And when they made the ring belts, I wrote a column criticizing it, and I said, I wrote for Ring, many years ago. I know all these people who work there, and they're good, ethical people, but they're not always going to be the people running it. And in the 70s, there was Johnny Ort was the editor of the magazine, and there was corruption. A lot of it, and if you just look up Ring Scandal Johnny Ort, you'll find it, and search for that on the internet. And so I just don't believe that. So now, yeah, Dana's now saying Meta is going to have a role. I guess it's going to be somehow using AI in the rankings, and we'll see what happens. I know Dana's just really, really bitter about the way the fights are ranked, but I think that that's their fault because they're the ones that opened the door to all these people who we never heard of covering fights, and I mean ranking the fighters.
Yeah, and that was going to be my next question actually. Do you think that this is for the betterment of the sport or worse off?
Well, I think it's good to have rankings, right? In boxing, the rankings are done by the sanctioning bodies, and so they're out for the betterment of themselves, and so they don't care about the sport as long as it makes them money, then they care, right? But if there's two fighters that aren't very popular, but are maybe good fighters, they're not necessarily going to advocate for them to be mandatories or to be ranked highly, right? They're going to put the big name, like think of Mauricio Suleiman, who I consider a friend, the president of the WBC. What fight was it? He said he was going to rank Jake Paul after was it the Tommy Fury fight? I think he said. Like, are you freaking kidding me? You're going to rank Jake Paul? Get the hell out of here, right? And I mean, it was a joke, but he knew Jake Paul was going to bring big bucks in, and if they, we get attention, blah blah blah, and that was what his thing was doing. So I think if they get this meta ranking and it can be done, I don't know all the details yet, but I'm assuming Dana has said AI is going to be a part of it. So we'll see how it plays out. It can't be worse than what they have.
Well, once again, it's props to Dana for keeping up with the times, bringing technology into the sport to better the sport. So again, why he's been so successful, it just continues to evolve and develop. People can say whatever they want to say about him, but the man's the man, really. Um, let's look at your personal journey now. I mean, you've covered multiple fights, you've interviewed many fighters. What would you say is your most memorable interview or moment in your boxing journalism, maybe journey?
So many crazy interviews. Like I interviewed Tyson the night of the bite fight. I was in the back. So the story about that was that at that time, that's when newspapers were still dominant. I was working for a newspaper in Las Vegas, and with all the promoters, when there was a fight in Vegas on a Saturday night, they had a deal with me where they would come get me as soon as the fight ended, and they would bring me into the locker room to interview the winner of the main event, so that I could get at least quotes in this paper the next day. They wanted to have the local paper when people got to the airport, pick up the paper, and there was at least comments from the winner of the fight in the paper. So that night, the bite happens, and I mean, you can't even imagine how crazy it was in the casino, and all, I mean, it was crazy in the casino, but it was also crazy in the arena. Bob Sheridan, who was announcing on the international feed, had a heart attack. He's being carried out as all these people are running into the. I mean, it was going crazy. So Alan Hopper was the PR person for Don King Productions, and he always called me Kevy, and he said, "Hey, Kevy, you want to go back and talk to the winner?" And Holyfield was the winner by disqualification. So I said, "Yeah, let's go." So I go back, and then commission. They have Holyfield locked up. Doctors are examining him. They won't let us talk to him, or let me talk to him. And so they said, "No, you can't get in." So we were going to walk back out, and I see Mike leaving. He just got done interviewing with Jim Gray. So I run down the hallway, and there was a entrance where garage where the cars could come in, and so the cars would come in and turn around. So he just got done with Jim Crayo's Showtime, so I ran and I got past him, and then I turned around and I held up, my tape recorder, which we used to carry tape recorders at the time, and I met eyes with him and I said, "Will you talk to me?" And he says, "Yes." So I said, "Mike, what happened?" He goes, "What the fuck do you think meant happened?" He goes, "The motherfucker was biting me the whole time." And he was just like, butting me, not biting me, butting me the whole time. And he was like all bent out of shape. And, so Tyson and I have a great relationship. And there was one of his bodyguards looks at the manager and team, and they get him out of here. And they push Mike in the car, they shove me out of the way, and the car goes. So that was kind of a crazy night. Also, and you can find this interview on YouTube, and the story was really funny of this, and I don't know if we have time to tell it. I could tell it in full, but I interviewed during the pandemic. I interviewed Mike when I was working. I interviewed Mike during the pandemic, and we were just talking. It was about a 40-minute interview, and toward the end, he brought up. He goes, "Do you remember that time that Meg Ryan was in the gym and you were there?" And I said, "Oh, of course." And he goes, "Well, that story you wrote was the best story anybody ever had written about me. But what had happened was this: he was getting ready to fight Clifford Etienne." And I went to the gym one day to watch him work out. Freddie Roach was training Mike. And Mike had just gotten the tattoo, so everybody wanted to see Mike with the tattoo on. It was new. So I go to the gym, and it was me. Tim Dahlberg was the only other reporter. He was the writer for the Associated Press. And then we see this pretty good-looking woman standing there shooting photos. We didn't have any idea who it was, and it was Meg Ryan, the actress. And then there was Freddie Roach, who was training him, and Mike. And when we got there, Mike was hitting mitts. So we go back. It was at the Gold Gloves Gym in Las Vegas. We go in the locker room, and Mike walks in. So the first thing he does, he drops his pants, and Meg is standing right there. And it's a tiny locker room, so we're like 5 of us, and we're all close, And so Mike is, kind of grabbing himself as he's, just taking his pants off. And then he tries to shake hands with me. I said, "No, thanks. We're good, right?" And Meg is just she doesn't know what's going on. So he said to me, he goes, "Kevin," he goes, "I tried to call you the other day, and you hung up on me. You treated me like an N." Well, what had happened was, that was the story he talked about in the video. I had written a story about him, and he wanted to call me to thank me. I answered the phone, and the guy goes, "Kevin, it's Mike Tyson." And I said, "This is the worst Mike Tyson impersonation I ever heard," and I hung up. So in the locker room, he says, he goes, "I tried to be nice to you, and you hung up on me and treated me like an N." And I was like, "Oh my God, that was you?" And then later that day, he looks at Meg Ryan, and he mistook her for Melanie Griffith, another actress. And he said to Meg, "How are your mother's tigers?" And Meg says, "My mother doesn't have tigers." He goes, "I was just with your mother a bit ago, and I was talking about her tigers." Well, it turned out that Melanie Griffith's mother, who was an actress named Tippi Hedren, had tigers, and so he had mistaken Meg Ryan for Melanie Griffith, and so that was kind of a funny day that we had in there with Mike. So with Mike, you never knew what was going to happen.
Never a dull moment with Mike, eh?
Mike was the best, right? And just so many funny stories with him, and craziness.
There you go. Definitely a decorated journey. Mike Tyson, what a human being. If I said to you, Kevin, it's 2030, right? It's 2030 is meant to be a big year in the world. I don't know why everyone keeps harping on about 2030 and whatnot. What would the newspaper boxing section headline be?
Wow, 2030. Boxing is back, baby. So try to be optimistic, right?
It's funny because Dana and Turkey have a 5-year deal, so we'd be deep into that deal.
That would be the end of their deal, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
Well, I think if boxing turns around, Dana and Turkey are going to have a big influence on it, but it's going to have to be beyond them. So hopefully what Dana and Turkey do inspires other promoters, and and really not just to be exclusionary, but to try to, now I know Dana's plan is not to work with any of the other promoters if he can help it, right? I think he's going to be forced to at the beginning until he gets a roster of fighters of his own. But I think, we have to have as few entities as possible and everybody coming together, and what I think.
Well, Kevin, it's happening already. He's had that impact already. PVC in Top Rank, there was an article about them in boxing scene saying that they're going to start working together. I mean,
I'll
where have you
believe
been
that
all
when I
this
see
time?
it. Like, we're 10 years out from Mayweather Pacquiao, right? And so they co-promoted Mayweather Pacquiao, and even the week of the fight, they were fighting. Like, the tickets were. I was the one that broke the freaking story. Tickets did not go on sale fight week until Tuesday of fight week, because Aram and Al Heyman couldn't come together. It was, people wanted to fly. I mean, I had people all over the world calling me, saying, "Hey, I'm supposed to fly to Las Vegas for the fight. When are the tickets on sale?" And it was like, who the hell knows? I mean, it was the craziest thing ever.
It's crazy you mentioned those two titans. They're two titans of the sport. They're pretty much on their way out. There's a new generation that's coming through. And it's a sad thing to say, of course, because they've contributed a ton. But we're seeing this new generation come through now, and hopefully we can get them working together. If somebody's going to get them working together indirectly, it's Turkey or Shake, because they're coming hard with Ring and with TKO. One last question for you. You're a journalist. You've been in the sport for a very long time. You understand the power of the narrative and storytelling, and that's what the UFC does very well. I believe so. Watching from the outside, they
Right.
bring the average Joe Blow from that nobody knows, who's got skill sets. Of course, you have to have some sort of skill set, and they put him through this marketing machine, and they build this story and narrative around him, and they have people believe that there's that relationship between them and this person that they've never met before, like they've known him
Right.
forever and ever. Now, that storytelling, um, I should say, machine or marketing machine has just been amplified with WWE coming into the
Yep.
picture, with Ari Emanuel's other businesses, WME, the agency of all the stars, and so on and so on. Now, do you believe that we're going to see that in the new TKO Boxing League? And how much of an advantage is that for TKO over the others that are currently in the sport?
Well, I think that they're going to get, they have relationships that are going to help them get TV deals that nobody else can get, right? ESPN in the U.S. has already said they're not going to renew with Top Rank. Okay, I wrote a story yesterday about ESPN maybe getting out of combat, but somebody high up at ESPN said to me, "Hey, if the deal's right, we would be in." But who would ESPN do a deal with if they did a deal for boxing? I think it would be TKO and nobody else, right? Netflix. Nick Khan is the president of the WWE. He negotiated their deal with Netflix. He's in TKO Group. I think you could see UFC go to Netflix very easily. Ari Emanuel has relationships there. So they are going to get premium. I'm anticipating them getting $1 billion US rights fees in their upcoming deal. And there's no, what was Top Rank getting? Like nothing like that, right? $90 million, I think it was. So there's going to be a huge, advantage going to their side. And I think, that they not only do they put on, like, what does a live network want? They don't want just big, they want constant content. And so UFC produces a ton of content. And in addition, they put, what do? They have 45 fight cards a year. You have the, fight nights and the pay-per-views. Then they have the Ultimate Fighter that has fights on it. They have the Dana White Contender Series that's 10 weeks in the summer that has fights on it. So they're producing so much content. And then, like you said, all the get to know yous. And then they have their press conferences are all streamed, which everybody does, but their media days are all streamed. And they have almost every fighter on the card show up at a media day. So if you're in boxing and you're in the first fight of the night, you don't have the ability to tell your story to the public. But you're in MMA and you get to the UFC, and you have to be a certain level of fighter to get to the UFC. But still, the low level UFC fighters are not that well known when they get in. They have the opportunity to tell their story right away. And they build that story each time out so that when they're championship contenders, they are actually well known. Where in boxing, a lot of times it's until you become a champion and you've had the title that you become well known, and that's an issue.
If you're a champion in the UFC, mainstream knows you. Like a huge chunk of
Right.
mainstream knows you because of their cross marketing. Terence Crawford's a boxing champion. I can guarantee you, not many know him outside the boxing world, and he's a phenomenal fighter. I mean, nothing
Yeah.
against him.
Maybe the best in the world.
Yeah, exactly. He's the next face. He beats Canelo. He's holding that torch. Doesn't matter what anyone says. So that's really the difference here. Is that, like we said, the narrative, the storytelling, and the labor intensive uh, extra activities that they put on for their fighters to build the brand of the fighters alongside, giving the networks what they want. So you said you reckon $1 billion, is that annually or over multiple
$1 billion a
years?
year. So I think they'll get a 7-year deal that'll be $7 billion, maybe an 8-year deal. So that'll be cumulative $1 billion a year.
Wow, that is insane. Well, there you go. It's a good note to finish on. Kevin, you've been very generous with your time. I want to sincerely thank you for joining me on the show. Any parting words for us?
Well, just if anybody can check out my website, you can see it back there, keviniole.com, my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Kevin Iole. I would be eternally grateful.
I'll put that in the description notes and let people know about it. Mr. Kevin Iole, thank you very much for joining me on Raw Sport. Thank you all who tuned in. Take care, everyone. We'll